Hi, I'm Pepe Karmel, and I'd like to tell you about my new book, Looking at Picasso. The first thing is that this is a book about Picasso's art, not about his life. There's a short biographical introduction followed by 5 chapters examining key periods and styles in his work. The first chapter is on symbolism. So it looks at his work from 1902 through 1907, following Picasso's transition from basically a 19th century artist to a radical modernist. So I start with the blue period pictures of tragic, emaciated figures drenched in sadness. Then I go on to the rose period, where Picasso makes pictures of circus performers, people who make the public laugh while their hearts are breaking. It's a kind of 1900 cliche, but it's still effective. And then in 1907, he paints the Demoiselle d'Avignon, which is a radically new kind of painting. First of all, it has very confrontational subject matter, prostitutes in the parlor of a brothel. Secondly, it has a radical new style. It combines models from archaic Greek, ancient Egyptian, and contemporary African art. No one had ever seen anything quite like it, and frankly, at the time it was done, it didn't get a very good reception. But instead of being discouraged, Picasso went on to something even more radical, which was Cubism, the subject of the next chapter. Cubism is the biggest revolution in 20th century art. It was invented by Picasso in partnership with the French artist Georges Braque. It's still confusing, frankly, to most viewers, but it makes sense if you follow its evolution, which is what I do in this chapter. In 1908, Picasso defines the human figure more precisely by dividing it up into facets like a diamond. In 1910, the facets start to break free from the surfaces of bodies and objects. Then to hang on to some kind of order, Picasso and Braque introduce a geometric lattice, like the steel girders inside a skyscraper. Then they pin the floating facets to that grid. In 1911 and 12, as their work gets more and more abstract, they compensate for this by introducing little bits of reality: printed lettering, wood graining, newspaper headlines. Finally, Picasso decides there's no need to bother painting these finicky details. He can just cut them out and glue them to his pictures. So that's what he does, starting the whole movement of collage. So in 1910 to 12, Cubism leads to 2 key movements in modern art. One is geometric abstraction, based on that geometric lattice I was just talking about. The other is montage, based on the principle of collage, of gluing things into pictures. But Picasso himself really goes in another direction after 1913 or so. From 1914 through 1924, he almost abandons the grid. Instead, he reinvents Cubism as an art of overlapping planes, sometimes geometric, sometimes curved, glowing with color and texture. This is a kind of Cubism that's sometimes called decorative, and it's just crazy beautiful. The next chapter of the book looks at Picasso's surrealistic work. And here there's a kind of parting of the ways in Picasso's work. He goes in multiple directions at the same time. He starts working in multiple styles. One of them is surrealism. By this moment, I should say, he is the acknowledged leader of the avant-garde, so the fact that he goes both left and right, more radical and more conservative, makes everybody a little crazy. But the surrealism really starts out as an extension of Cubism. Picasso plays with geometry. This leads him to designs that look like star charts and constellations. By 1929, these turn into revolutionary sculptures made from iron rods welded together to make abstract figures. These are the first welded sculptures, something that becomes a huge movement, particularly after World War II. In other sketches, Picasso starts with doodles, and these lead to a kind of curvilinear cubism of interweaving lines with distorted figures hidden inside an abstract web. When these distorted figures emerge from the web in the later 1920s, people call them monsters. But what they are, really, I think, is Picasso's attempt to represent the human figure through the lens of desire as we perceive it during an intimate embrace, not as we see it from a distance, which is what Western art usually shows. Then, by 1932, these so-called monsters turn into glowing, beautiful figures like The Dream and The Girl Before a Mirror, which finishes that chapter. Then I double back to the beginning of the 1920s to look at Picasso's classical work and the way it evolves from 1920 up to the mid-1930s at the same time that he's pursuing surrealism. So, tracing the evolution of Picasso's classical work, you can see that he's fascinated by a contradiction within classicism. Is it an art of noble simplicity and calm grandeur, as critics thought in the 18th century? Or is it an art reflecting the narratives of Greek legends, which are full of lust and violence, all kinds of crazy goings on? Well, the early classical work by Picasso, his monumental nudes of the early 1920s, reflect the ideas of calm and nobility. But then his etchings of the 1930s provide a more ambivalent picture. Some of them show a handsome sculptor and a beautiful model looking calmly at the sculptures they've made together. Others depict the exploits of the Minotaur, a terrifying man-beast who is torn between lust and remorse. So that's where Picasso's classicism ends up. The last chapter of the book is called War and Peace, and it follows Picasso from the late 1930s to the early 1970s, decades when he becomes a public figure, not just in the art world, but in the larger world. In 1937, he paints his mural Guernica, where he uses the private language of surrealism to express the horror of the Spanish Civil War. The result is the greatest political painting of the 20th century, and the 21st so far. After World War II, Picasso declares his allegiance to the French Communist Party, creating his famous dove for the party as a symbol of peace. But at the same time, other pictures like his Woman Flower and The Joy of Life simply celebrate the pleasures of life in post-war France. They're not political at all. Meanwhile, he becomes fascinated with the idea of art as a sign language, which is visible in paintings like The Kitchen, which is his mural-scale challenge to abstract expressionism. Finally, in 1951, well, not finally, in 1951, Picasso turned 70. He's still got 20 years to go. The work of these last 20 years responds to his experience of old age, and one of its themes is the contrast between the decline of the body and the persistence of desire. So these can be very painful pictures. But his very last paintings, like The Boy with the Sand Shovel, return to images of youth, as if Picasso simply wanted to start all over again as a young artist and do it all again. So, looking at Picasso's career as a whole, I think back to what the German critic Karl Einstein said in 1931, when he wrote that Picasso's work was a signal of how much freedom this age could possess. My book is a celebration of that freedom.